Welcome to the Stoic Responder Podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Healy. As a special agent who spent more than 15 years conducting large-scale fraud, money laundering, and public corruption investigations, Stoic philosophy provided a mindset edge that became the foundation of my professional success. My mission today is to share those same ancient mindset lessons with you so that you can turn obstacles into opportunities and adversity into advantage. Time to muster up.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Stoic Responder Podcast. This is episode 19. Title of today's episode, How You Bear It. Before we get started, real quick, if you guys are watching on YouTube, you'll notice I'm wearing a shirt from the Overwatch Collective. This is an incredible organization that I am proud to represent, proud to talk about as a 501c3 organization that's providing therapy services for first responders. If you are a first responder listening to this, if you are dealing with something and you need to talk to somebody and you're afraid that that stigma exists, that if you open your mouth within your department, you're going to get othered, you're going to get put on that rubber gun squad, you're going to get admin. Overwatch Collective. Reach out to the Overwatch Collective. Reach out to these guys. They are providing therapy services for our first responders who desperately need them. One more is one less is their motto. It means one more person that is getting services is maybe one less person who's committing suicide. I want to be dead serious about this with you guys. The reason I am doing this podcast, the reason I wrote my book is to contribute to this wellness movement within the first responder and law enforcement community. I desperately want there to be more tools out there to help our heroes, help our first responders find what they need to live their lives well, both on and off the job. And that is what the Overwatch Collective is doing. Those guys are heroes. Support that organization, even if you don't need them yourself. Share the message about the Overwatch Collective, what they are doing, completely free therapy services for your fellow law enforcement members. Support them any way you can. Buy some merch. Go over there, make a donation. If you're on the West Coast and you can attend the fundraisers that they put on, go to one of their fundraisers. Awesome organization. Cannot say enough about them. And if you look on the YouTube, I'm also wearing a hat from Blue Badge Coffee Company. My friend Rick Leckleitner, again, another Bay Area guy, doing great things for his fellow first responders. He's got a coffee company where they're putting premium coffee out there. It is a first responder run business, a law enforcement run business, Blue Badge Coffee Company. And every purchase you make from Blue Badge Coffee Company is going to support peer support services at police departments around the country. So again, guys who are out there contributing to the well-being of first responders, if you are somebody who is contributing to the well-being of first responders, give me a shout. I will put your name out there. I'll put your information out there on this podcast, because anything that we can do to contribute to these sort of services for our first responder community, I am there for. So check out the Overwatch Collective. Check out Blue Badge Coffee Company. Go support some good guys doing some good things for your community. Folks, getting into the episode here. This is, as I said, episode 19, How You Bear It. Let me start you out with a quote from Seneca. It does not matter what you bear, but how you bear it. I'm going to tell you a story, guys. Some of you, this this blows my mind because I feel like time stands still for me in a lot of ways. But 9/11 happened almost 23 years ago this fall, over 22 years ago in the past. And I take for granted that people who are in this profession were around on 9/11 or remember it or have a personal story or association with it. And that's not necessarily the case. In fact, more and more the people who are entering law enforcement these days as 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old kids weren't even alive on 9/11. Or if they were alive, people who are in their mid-20s were young. They were babies. They don't remember it. For me, it was a life-changing event. It was the day before my 22nd birthday. I was a college graduate. I was working in the field, working for one of my professors before I went back to graduate school. I had an anthropology degree. I was working as an archaeologist. I've told this story before, but I was working as an archaeologist in the field on September 11, 2001. I had my whole life laid out in front of me. I was going to work in the field for my professor for a year. I was going to go back to school that following fall. I was going to get my master's degree. I was going to go on and get a PhD. I was going to become an archaeology professor. That's entirely what I intended to do. I got back to the hotel room that night. I had no idea we were under attack. I turned on SportsCenter, and right there on the screen behind Stuart Scott or Bob Lee or whoever it was giving what I was expecting to see baseball scores, there's the towers collapsing. That's how I learned we had been attacked, about 7 o'clock at night on September 11th. And like everybody else who was alive at the time or who was old enough to remember it and to feel that, it was a conscious experience for me. And it meant an incredible amount to me. In fact, I keep on my desk here this bracelet that I have of firefighter Richard Allen from Fire Department New York, Ladder 15, who died on 9/11. I picked this up shortly after 9/11 on a trip to New York and have kept it ever since and wore it for years and years when I was on the job. I didn't know that fireman. I didn't know that firefighter, but it deeply impacted me and it drove me into a career as a first responder. And I wanted to be physically reminded of somebody who lost their life that day serving others. That was my motivation to get into a life of service. So I wanted to talk about that today because there's a great story that if you have seen the movie World Trade Center, the Oliver Stone movie World Trade Center, you're familiar with this, but it's a great story about perseverance on September 11th I want to share. And if you are somebody who wasn't there, who didn't experience it the way that some of us did, didn't internalize it, didn't direct your career the way it did for some of us, pay attention. So some of you may or may not know, but shortly after the attack, it was considered a rescue operation. The idea was that these towers collapsed and there were likely people who were trapped underground. There was an entire underground network below the World Trade Center where the train station came in, and kind of like if you're from Houston, if you've ever been downtown in downtown Houston, there's an entire network of tunnels that sits underneath the city so that people don't have to pop out and, in 100-degree weather in the summertime. You can connect all over downtown Houston without ever coming up for air. World Trade Center had that sort of subterranean level. And so there was a thought process at the time that there were people who were likely fleeing from one of the towers through that subterranean area and maybe were trapped. They were stuck when the towers collapsed. So there was still a rescue effort underway for the first 72 hours, 96 hours after the attacks. But at the end of the day, there were only at the end of the week, the attack was on a Tuesday. By the end of the week, I think they'd only freed about 20 people, something like that. And two of them were Will Jimeno and John McLoughlin. So we're going to get into that story today. So Will Jimeno was a 33-year-old rookie cop for the Port Authority Police Department on the morning of September 11th. Brand new cop. Now, he had done some other things in his life. Obviously, you come to policing at age 30 plus, you've probably done some other things, maybe had a whole other career at that point. But he comes to the Port Authority Police Department morning of September 11, 2001. Shortly after American Airlines Flight 11 strikes the North Tower, Jimeno and about 20 of his colleagues, they get on a commandeered city bus, and they're making their way towards the World Trade Center to respond. And as they do, they enter the mezzanine between the buildings, that area, that kind of subterranean area between the buildings. Now, when the South Tower begins to collapse minutes later, because these guys show up on the scene, they have no idea what's going on. They don't understand it's a terrorist attack. They just know that a tower was struck by an airplane. They're doing everything that they can to help others. They show up. They're looking for supplies, and they run into one of their colleagues downstairs in this mezzanine area, right? And these guys are kind of figuring out, here's your mask, here's this, here's that, where are we going, what are we doing? And the South Tower starts to collapse. I mean, they've been on the scene just a couple of minutes. So Jimeno and his colleague, Dominick Pezzulo, and their sergeant, a guy named John McLoughlin, and McLoughlin rather, if you have seen the movie, he's played by Nicolas Cage. They get trapped in a freight elevator some 20 feet beneath the wreckage, because as the tower's collapsing, they all kind of dive into this freight elevator. So they get trapped inside this freight elevator under 20 feet beneath the wreckage between a 110-story building that's collapsed on top of them. Now, with the subsequent collapse of the North Tower, they stuff everything that's on top of them, starts to shift around, and Pezzulo, who is trapped, gets killed by shifting debris. So it just leaves McLoughlin and Jimeno left. Now, there were, again, like 20 of their colleagues all rushed in there together, and there's only two of them. And it's smoking. There's groaning, creaking rubble around them. The fires are burning around them. And they're just assuming that as this is all happening, as this is shifting, and they don't really understand. They don't know. They have no communication. They don't know this was a terrorist attack. They don't know both towers have collapsed. All they know is that they're trapped. They're stuck. And it would be reasonable for them to wonder, when are we going to be finished off? When is this going to shift? When is this Jenga pile going to fall and collapse in on us and kill both of us as well? But for more than 11 hours, the two of them endured. They're not right next to each other. They can barely see each other. They're pinned. They're both in a ton of pain. They're both badly injured, but they keep each other's spirits up. They keep each other engaged with personal stories, with anecdotes. They take turns shouting for help. And then miraculously, some 11 hours later, their cries were heard by two former U.S. Marines who just showed up on the scene as volunteers. That's a story for another day. The story of Dave Carnes and the other Marine who showed up on the scene, who kind of put on their uniforms and bluffed their way into Ground Zero to go and join the search effort. That's a whole story for a different day. Just an incredible story of service and sacrifice on the part of those guys. But those guys were just walking around, just trying to find people, trying to help, and they heard the shouts for help after 11 hours of being trapped and pinned. Now, throughout this ordeal, Jimeno and McLoughlin suffered unimaginable pain. Their close friend is dead right next to them. They don't know what's happened to all their colleagues. They're suffering from crush injuries. They're suffering from smoke inhalation, chemical inhalation, all of this, inhalation, all this stuff. And this paralyzing fear on top of all of that. But both of them, collectively, they took it upon themselves to bear that suffering with resilience. Not so much for themselves, but to benefit the other. You see, it was that mutual commitment to endure that both men have credited to their survival. McLoughlin credits Jimeno. McLoughlin credits Jimeno for his survival. Jimeno credits McLoughlin for his, basically saying, if it hadn't have been for him, I wouldn't have made it, vice versa. So they're both trapped under the weight of a 110-story office building. And it's only that shared commitment to survival, to making sure the other has what he needs to get out of this, that allows them to emerge, not unscathed, but alive. You see, at the end of the week, when it became a recovery situation, instead of a rescue situation, Jimeno and McLoughlin were two of only 20 survivors to actually emerge from the collapsed buildings. Think of that, like 50,000 people at work in these buildings, over 3,000 killed, and 220 stories worth of office building in Manhattan collapsing in on themselves. Only about 20 people emerged, and they were two of them. Now, their amazing story, it reminds us that even when times are incredibly tough, unimaginable despair, it is within our power to control our mind. It is within our power to bear that burden with resilience and courage. I tell this story a lot. I talk about this story a lot from a Stoic perspective. We talk a lot about James Stockdale, the highest ranking naval officer who was held by the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. He was held in Hanoi Hilton. He was tortured for 8 years, overcame that, survived. We tell this story a lot through the lens of Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor who lost his wife, his mother, father, and brother, I believe, to the Nazis in the ghettos, and then later in numerous, I think he was in 3 different concentration camps. He survived. He wrote an entire book about it called Man's Search for Meaning, which described how he used essentially Epictetus's guidance to overcome, Stoic mindset to overcome. These stories, Jimeno, McLoughlin, the stories of Stockdale, the stories of Frankl, they tell us that even in times of unimaginable despair, it is within our power to control our mind. That remains firmly within our control. And we can bear the burden that we're faced with resilience and courage. It reminds us that what defines our character is not the adversity we face, because that is incredible adversity that they face, but that is not what defines the character. It's the attitude with which we face it. You see, you may not be facing something on the level of a Viktor Frankl or a James Stockdale or a Will Jimeno or a John McLoughlin. You may not be facing something that overwhelming. But whatever it is that you're struggling with, whatever adversity is that you're facing, whatever it is that you're dealing with, it doesn't matter. What defines your character is the attitude with which you face it, is the manner with which you face it, is with how much control you maintain over your own mind, is how much you bear that burden with resilience. So I'm giving you a incredibly challenging example to illustrate for you that maybe that thing that you're dealing with right now, maybe you can get through it too with a little bit of resilience, and you can bear it well. All right, guys, journal time. Got a journal entry for you today. I want you to write this down. I want you to ask this question of yourself. Am I bearing life's difficulties with a calm, rational, and determined demeanor? Because ultimately, that's what it takes. If you want to gain resilience, if you want to get through whatever you are being faced with, whatever challenge is overwhelming you right now, whatever adversity you are struggling through, the manner in which you face it matters. You have to face it with a calm, rational, and determined demeanor. So ask yourself and answer honestly, am I bearing life's difficulties today with a calm, rational, and determined demeanor? Folks, thanks for listening. If you'd like to support this podcast, there's a few ways you can do it. Number one, you can pick up a copy of my book, In Valor, 365 Stoic Meditations for First Responders. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere you get your books. Pick up a copy. You can get it on Kindle, Nook. You can get the physical paperback edition, which I love because you can take notes. You can highlight passages. You can flip through it at will. But it's going to be a lot like this podcast. It is going to give you a daily Stoic quote. It's going to give you some contextualization, a story that you can relay it to, and it's going to give you a journal prompt or an action item that you can do to integrate that knowledge right now today. Number two, you can subscribe to the Substack, Stoic Responder, for free. On that page, you can get the podcast delivered to your email. You can get my weekly newsletters with Stoic leadership and personal development tips if you subscribe to the Stoic Responder Substack. And finally, you can like, share, and subscribe this podcast wherever you get it, whether it's YouTube, whether it's Apple Podcasts, whether it's Spotify, whether it's Amazon, wherever you get it. Like, share, and subscribe so that others can learn about what we're doing here and can benefit from these lessons as well. Thanks so much for listening, folks. Until next time, you are out of roll.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, like, rate, and share this podcast so that we can spread the benefits of Stoicism to other first responders. It will only take you a few moments, but it can help us tremendously. Until next time, out of roll.